Welcome today to Ancestry Part 4, presented to you by the West Hempstead Public Library, and our presenter today will be Jean King. We are going to review a few things that will be the final part of our Ancestry series, and I'm going to let Jean take it away from here. Hang on, thank you.
Okay, so
that it's okay to record.
okay, so everyone just mute yourself, I guess. Can you guys, yeah. Okay, so the recording started and I'm going to switch to sharing my screen. Okay. So this afternoon, our topic is census records. And what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to start with New York State census records and then move on to US federal census records because we have a lot more information on the federal census records than New York State. So I thought I'd do New York State first. The reason I wanted to do this program in April is because you may know that on April 1st, they released the 1950 census records to the public. So I thought this would be good timing to talk about census records. So with New York State, they conducted a census every 10 years on the fives, or that was the plan at least, except for 1885 and 1895. And sorry, a fire in the Capitol building in Albany destroyed the early state census records for 1825, 1835, and 1845. So the records you can find online only started 1855, and it's because of this fire that happened in Albany. New York State actually has quite a number of state census records compared to other states. So we're lucky that we had as many as we do that survived. So I wanted to just go over some of the items that you could find on each of these census records that did survive, and some of the unusual or different questions that varied from census to census. So if we start in 1855, this census is important because it recorded the relationship of people to the head of households. And on the federal census papers, this didn't happen until 1880. So if you can find your relatives in 1855 on the state census, you'll already be able to establish relationships between the different people in the households. On this census, they also asked for the state or country of origin. And if it was New York State, they wanted to know the county. And at the back of the enumeration districts for each area, you'll find marriages and deaths that cover the period of June 1854 to June 1855. However, there are no names attached. So it's just an age and what this person died from, but you have no idea who the person is they're talking about because there's no names listed. So for the Long Island, Westchester area, for 1855, the counties that survived are Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Staten Island. Excuse me. If we go on to 1865, one of the questions that they asked were the number of times you were married, the number of children born to the mother, military service questions because we're still in the Civil War at this time. There's a list of deaths of officers and enlisted men. And again, they have marriages and deaths listed, but this time there's actually names to go with them. And again, for the same kind of time period from June to June, 1864 to 1865. And for this year, for our area, we have Suffolk County, Brooklyn, and Staten Island. In 1875, it's very similar to the questions asked in 1865, but they asked a few more questions about military service because now the war was over. And they do have marriages and deaths again with names from June to June for 1874 and 1875. And we have Brooklyn and Staten Island for that year. They decided to do a census in 1892 because they never did one in 1885, but it's a very abbreviated census, I guess you'd say, because they only list the name, the country of birth, citizenship status, and the person's occupation. And for this year, you can find Brooklyn and Queens. I read that apparently it was a lot of political squabbling between parties that caused them not to agree on taking a census in 1885 or 1895. So we move on to 1905, which was similar questions to our 1892 census, but it also asked the person the number of years they've been living in the United States. And here we can find Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Westchester counties. Now, finally, the last two that were taken were in 1915 and 1925, and all the counties in New York State are available, and the images are available on Ancestry.com or Ancestry Library Edition. An unusual question for both these years was if you were an inmate in an institution, you were to list the address where you were living at the time of admission and the date of admission to that institution. Now, you can also find some of these New York State Census records on Family Search, which is a free website, but unfortunately, the 1915 and 1925 census, you cannot see the image on Family Search. It's only a transcription. And I'll show you that in a minute. New York State decided to discontinue the state census in 1931. So again, you could find these records online at Ancestry, Ancestry.com, New York, and Family Search. I also have a list for you down here if you're interested in some more information about the New York State Census. There are some good articles at the New York State Library website. I found an article about the fire that destroyed those early census records. The Family Search Wiki is very helpful, and Cindy's list. There's a guide from the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society. And also there is a link to the 1845 Indian Reservation census records that was digitized by the New York State Archives. And there is one book that's helpful called New York State Censuses and Substitutes by William Dollarhide, if you really want to get a lot of detail about the census records. So I'm going to switch over to the West Hempstead Library website to show you some examples. And can everybody see my screen that says the library? West Hempstead Library, can you see it? Yeah? Okay. So we go down to genealogy. And as you may know, you have to use Ancestry in the library. You can't use it from home. I'll click on Library Edition. And over here, you can search just census records. And I'm going to use my Staten Island relatives. Oops. And hopefully this is going to work. Okay, so over here you can pick the decade, and I'm looking for someone in 1855. So in 1855, here you can see they're actually describing what buildings were made of and the value of the building the person was living in, their age, their relationship to head of household, where they were born, and their occupation. And over here, they ask, do they own the land? Are they naturalized citizens or aliens? Or were they born here? So it's not a lot of detail like the federal census, but it does give you that head of household relationship, which is important. And if we go to 1865, so in 1865, we have similar questions as before, but I wanted to show you. Okay. That right in the middle of some of the census pages, then you see additional questions, which is not how it's usually set up, but they have questions relating to deaf, dumb, and blind people, and then questions about officers and enlisted men who are now in the military or naval service. They also have listed people who had been in the military or naval service. And then if you go all the way to the back of this enumeration district, it's this page. Let's see. There we go. So all the way in the back, they list the deaths that occurred in the year ending June 1st, 1865, with the people's names, their ages, the date of death, their native state or country, their trade, and then what they died of. And it looks like we have consumption, inflammation of the lungs, and inflammation of the brain. And then up here, there was one marriage. And you've got the bride and the groom, the date of the marriage, and where in Staten Island it occurred, and that it was by a clergyman. And then 1875. And there's similar questions again about material of the house. They're asking now if you were married, widowed, or single in these columns. So they added that. They added, and then the column for naturalized or born here, owner of land. So again, similar to the other one, And then in the back, hopefully, this one. Oh, so here's deaths. Deaths that occurred ending June 1st, 1875, and they had a lot of deaths for this area. And again, over here, you can see what they died from. More TB. TB, looks like some, oh, wow, rheumatoid arthritis. Well, and old age. And let's see if there's these. Each one's a little different. Let's see what's on the last page. I have to poke around sometimes. Okay, apparently no. Apparently they didn't have any marriages in this one, but they list the, this is also in the very back here. They list the places of public worship, if they had newspapers being printed there, how many inns, hotels, and taverns, an idea of wages. So going into the back of these New York State ones, you can find some interesting details. Then if we go over to 19, change the name. Just wanted to show you that 1925 state census. This was the last one that was taken. They do have street names on this one and house numbers. The citizenship status, number of years you've been in the United States. But what I wanted to show you also is that if we go to Family Search, which is the free site that's run by the Mormon Church, you have to set up a free username and password. But if we go here, we go into records over here, and we put in New York. Okay, so you can see that Family Search also has these New York Census records. But if we look at 1925, get rid of this. And I pull up one of these records on Family Search, you're going to see that there's no image because Ancestry has the rights to the images and they block it. But what you can get on Family Search is basically a transcription of the census. So it's somewhat helpful, but it's just a little annoying that you can't see the image without going to Ancestry. Okay. And I was looking for. All right, so for the other New York State Census records on Family Search, there's images. It's just the 1915 and the 1925 that you don't have any images when you go to Family Search. And it's always good to look at both of them because you may not find someone on Ancestry because of spelling errors. and you may find them on Family Search. So it's always good to compare the two websites if you're having trouble finding your relative. But now let us go on to federal census records. So we have a lot to talk about on the federal census records since we had that new census come out this year. For the federal census records, they're taken every 10 years and they become public 72 years after the census was taken. So that is why the 1950 census became available this year on April 1st, since the 72-year embargo now is over. When you're looking at federal census records, it's important to look at the date that the census was taken, because the federal census dates changed a lot of times until 1930. So originally, the censuses were taken on the first Monday in August. Then from 1830 to 1880 and 1900, they were taken on June 1st. But in 1910, it was April 15th. And in 1920, it was January 1st. And then finally, in 1930, it became April 1st, which it's been ever since. And because people are answering the questions based on the date that the census is being taken, that's why you want to make sure you understand, what date for the year you're looking at, what month you're talking about. Now, the early census records really don't give us very much information. Up to and including 1840, the only information you're really seeing is the name of the head of household. And then they use tick marks to indicate male and females that were in that household based on age range. So you don't even have an exact age for these unknown people. It's just an age range. But finally, in 1850, the census does list the name of every individual, their occupation, their place of birth, and the real value of the real estate. But even though it lists the name of every individual, it does not give you any relationship between the people in the household. So you don't know if it's a married couple, you don't know if the younger people are their children. There's just no relationship stated. In 1860, they asked these other questions, and then also added a question about the value of personal estates as opposed to just the value of the real estate. And then in 1870, we get some more genealogy related questions, like whether the person's parents were foreign born, when the person was born or married, if the person was born or married within the year that this census was being taken, whether men 21 and older were citizens, and this one I found interesting, whether a man 21 years or older was denied voting for reasons other than committing a crime. So I was guessing the end of the Civil War, there was issues with people being allowed to vote, and maybe that's where this question came from. In 1880, now we finally identify people by relationship between household members. There's also the parent's place of birth is asked. It's the first time that it lists street addresses. And they added marital status choices of single, married, or widowed. And they also asked, were you married during the current year? And the current year being whatever date the census was being taken and the year before, that 12 months before. There was an 1890 census, but it was destroyed by a fire in 1921 in the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C. And for New York State, the only fragments that survive are some from the town of Brookhaven and from Eastchester. And that's it. These are links to an article about the fire if you're interested in reading more about what happened. There was an 1890 veterans census, and this was only to list Union veterans and widows of Union veterans. And this census was requested by the pension office because they were developing pension legislation and wanted to get an idea of how many people would be requesting pensions. Unfortunately, Alabama through Kansas were destroyed, but lucky for us, New York survived, and it does have a lot of good information if you have relatives that were veterans of the Civil War, basically. Now, in 1900, a lot more questions were added to the census. It asked you the number of children born and how many children were living, which would be very helpful when you're doing your research. It's the only census that asked the month and the year of birth. It asked the number of years married, the year of immigration, the year of naturalization. They added divorced as one of the marital statuses, and they asked if you own or rented your home. And with this year of immigration, year of naturalization, sometimes I found it correct with my relatives, and sometimes they could be off by a year or two. So, you hope they remember correctly, but if they've been living in the United States a long time by 1900, they may not exactly remember their year of immigration or naturalization. But at least it gives you a starting point if you didn't know. In 1910, they asked if a man was a veteran of the Civil War. It indicated if it was the person's first or second marriage. And they asked how many years were you married in your current marriage. Again, they asked how many children had been given birth to and how many were still alive. They wanted to know if you spoke English or another language. And they also added the type or field of work that the person was employed in. Instead of just asking what their job was, they asked what their job and their field of work was. In 1920, there really wasn't anything new added except language spoken by parents. In 1930, they asked if there was a radio set in the household. They wanted to know the age at your first marriage. And it was the last census that they asked people if they could read or write. They also asked what the amount of your rent was or the value of your home. And in 1940, one of the questions was, where were you living in 1935? And if it wasn't the same place, they wanted you to supply where it was. They asked the highest school grade you had completed, the weeks you had worked in 1939. There was an X with a circle around it that indicated the person in the household who answered the questions. They also asked what was your salary for the previous 12 months. And 2 people per sheet were randomly selected to ask supplemental questions. This happens again in 1950, these supplemental questions. If you're interested, there are links to the actual instruction booklets that the enumerators used, and also a list of all the questions that were asked on each of these census records. And in addition, because these were considered population schedules, in addition, there also were other schedules done by the federal government called mortality schedules and agriculture and industrial schedules. And both of these you could search on Ancestry Library Edition or on Heritage Quest. And Heritage Quest, it should be available at any library you belong to in Nassau County. And with Heritage Quest, you can use it from home with your library card instead of having to come into the library to use Ancestry. And then I just jotted down a few problems that I thought of when searching census records. Probably the biggest problem is misspellings of the first and or last name of the person. Sometimes people's first names were recorded by their nickname. Sometimes their first names were just initials. Of course, the handwriting is very hard to read on some of these, and the transcribing on some of these censuses were sent out of the country, which could have caused a lot of misspellings also when they were being transcribed, which is why it's always good to look at a second source, like maybe Family Search, if you're having problems in Ancestry. You could also try swapping the first and last name on the search form in case that the names got switched, unintentionally by the enumerator. It's possible a neighbor could have provided information instead of family member, so the information may not be totally correct. There's been many boundary changes over the decades, and you need to make sure you're looking in the right county, depending on the year that you're looking for. People could misremember dates when they were answering the census takers, and also they could misunderstand the questions if there was a language barrier. Some people may have had a fear of the government and didn't want to answer questions. And it's always possible that for some reason, your family may not have been there when the enumerator came to visit. And even though I think they were supposed to go back at least a second time, it's possible that they just weren't there. So I wanted to, maybe I'll show you actually up to 1940 census records first, and then we'll do 1950. So if we go back to Ancestry, we'll go back to census. Okay, so on Ancestry, do that. This is a little different than the paid one. Okay, I'm going to switch to look for a different set of relatives. Okay, so again, you can pick the time period you're looking for over here. So we just want to look at 1900 for a minute. Where's my relatives? So for example, here's they actually highlight the people for you. And in 1900, you've got your street address down the side. This is the one where they asked the month and the year the person was born, how many children and how many children living, and she was widowed. You know, when did they come to the United States? Over here. And you can see when you hover, you can still see the questions. Years in the United States, whether they were still an alien or naturalized, their occupation. And these relatives were in Manhattan. And you can see that the enumerator was there June 12th and 13th when he was asking the questions. Oops. Wrong one. In 1910, we've got here this M1 means this is their first marriage and how many years they've been married. Where if you look up here, like this person has an M2, so that's actually a second marriage. And how many children, they're asking their birthplace, and what language they speak. So this servant was speaking French, their industry, whether they were owning or renting a farm or a house. Some of this handwriting is crazy. Okay, and again, the 20s, there's naturalization questions. The year naturalized, when they immigrated, and they asked, what language do you speak? If it's not English, birthplaces of the parents, and their occupation, and what type of employment. So he was being paid a wage, where someone up here that says AO was working for themselves. And then 40s. Then if we jump up to 1940, this is where they asked you, where were you living in 1935? And most of them are saying the same place. Education level, if you hover, college or high school level. Okay, this X with the circle means he's the one that answered the questions for their household. And then again, the occupation questions, and he was on his own. And they were even asking if they had income from other sources. Yes, we'll go. We have time. We'll do 1930 also. Okay, and then 1930. This is the one they were asking about whether you had the radio. They wanted to know what your home value was or the rent you were paying. Languages that you were what you spoke. Here they were asking you if you were a veteran and if you were, what war. So like this man here would have been World War One. It looks like World War One veterans here. So if you're not sure whether your relative was a veteran, this is one way you could find out. And then we'll just compare this. Change this. We'll just look at the 1880. And you can see compared to the ones we were just looking at, in 1880, there was far fewer questions. Just their relationship, a profession, place of birth, and where their parents were born, but not a whole lot of information besides that. And they did add marital status in 1880. But you can see it was a lot more detailed once we got to 1900. Yeah. And this was that 1892, the census that they took kind of in between because they never did one in 1885. And there's really, like I said, they only asked your name, your age, your sex, color, what country you were born in, and what your occupation was, and whether you were a citizen or an alien, and that was it. But they do have the street address at least up here, but there really wasn't much details to those. So let's go over back to our document here and talk a little bit about the 1950 census. Okay, so in 1950, they hired 140,000 enumerators who visited 46 million dwellings. The 1950 census was the last time people were personally visited. Starting with 1960, the forms were put in the mail and were to be mailed back to the Census Bureau. Okay, and here are some interesting facts that I read about the 1950 census. They had a missed persons campaign that took place in May, where they put articles and ads in newspapers to encourage people to fill out their census forms if they had been missed by the census taker. They had 2 different transient nights. The one night they went to hotels, YMCAs, and campgrounds. And another night they went to missions and cheap hotels to try and enumerate people, including the staff and employees. They had infant cards that were filled out for children born in January, February, or March. They had special forms created that were filled out by crew members on vessels that were turned over to the Census Bureau. College students were enumerated at their college address instead of their family home, and that is still what's done today. Other US territories and possessions had census records taken for American Samoa, Alaska, Guam, Hawaii, Now Zone, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands. There was overseas military and civilians who were counted for the census, but only on 4 Pacific islands: Canton, Johnston, Midway, and Wake. And the census did include temporary workers who were overseas, vacationing residents, and crews on ships that were at a US port. Now, because it was only just released, the commercial companies have not had time to create an index yet, a name index. But the National Archives does use a computer-generated name index, which is worth a shot while you're waiting for the commercial companies to do their indexing. We'll take a look at the National Archives website, but the name index they created is only for the head of households. So it's not in every name index, though you can search on state and county and the enumeration district if you have a street address. And we'll take a look at that real quick also. There is a website that could help you find the enumeration district for your person, but again, you have to have their street address in order to do that. So the questions they asked in 1950 aren't all that exciting, but your street number, your street address, were you living on a farm or a ranch? Did your house have more than 3 acres? It gave your relationship to head of household, age on your last birthday. They added separated as marital status. They were looking for the state or country of birth, naturalization status. Sorry. Yes, no, or born abroad of American parents. And that was a new category. They wanted to know if you were working, unable to work, keeping house, or doing something else most of the week. They were asking, were you looking for work? What did you do any work last week? If you didn't work last week, do you have a job? How many hours did you work? Your occupation, and the type of worker that you were, whether it was private, government, your own business, or without pay on family farm or business. Now, what's been going on with the commercial companies of Ancestry and MyHeritage is they actually have been able to do an every name index for these states that I have listed here. And in fact, they just added Hawaii yesterday. So it's an ongoing process where they're adding states every week or two, it seems like. So right now on Ancestry and MyHeritage, you could search these states and territories by name, and instead of having to know the street address. So you could search for Alaska, Delaware, Hawaii, Indian reservations, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, South Dakota, Vermont, Wyoming, and the territories of American Samoa, Virgin Islands, Guam, Panama Canal Zone, and overseas islands. FamilySearch.org is doing their own indexing, and it is going a bit slowly, it looks like, and they really don't have any states finished yet for a name index because they're using volunteers to do this. So it could be a while before they have their name index put together. Now, in general, you could find census records on Ancestry, FamilySearch, MyHeritage, Heritage Quest Online, which you get through the library, and another site called findmypast.com. And we'll take a look. We're going to take a look at the National Archives site in a minute for the 1950 census. I gave you a list of some books that are about census records in general that are available in Nassau County. And then I also gave you a list of YouTube videos mainly talking about the 1950 census. And I threw in a few articles also about the 1950 census, if you'd like to take a look at those. But this is the website for the National Archives 1950 census. And I did find people in here using just a name. So when you go to the site, you want to do your state and county. You know what? You don't even have to, this example, I don't even have to put in the county. So you get your results back. And they will even, it doesn't, they'll show you close matches also. It's not even just the exact name, but this happens to be my great grandparents. Yeah. A little hard to see, but you can blow it up. And my great grandparents are at the top of the page. So in 1950, you know, you can see questions that they asked, a lot pertaining to work, the date that they did this sheet, and then just those basic questions about their age, their marital status, where they were born, and if they were naturalized citizens. So actually, you don't even get as much information as you did on previous census records. This really doesn't have a lot of new information. But anybody who is on this line where there's a circle around the number, if you scroll down, they were asked these supplemental questions. So you may luck out and one of your ancestors may have answered a supplemental question. You can also search by enumeration district, and I could show you, don't have a lot of time left, but I could show you real fast maybe. If you go back to Ancestry, let me go to the homepage. Their homepage is a little different. If we go down to 1950 census, it says explore maps. If you click in here and put an address, this happens to be where my great uncle lived in 1950. And it gives me this number here, 30-184. And if I went back to this website and put in Nassau County, oh, great, it didn't work. Well, it's supposed to work. Oh, because I have the name. Okay. And what happens is you have to search page by page, trying to find the street address. And you can blow up each one of these sheets, but it can be a bit tedious having to go through page by page looking for your sheet. But this is actually, I think, his avenue. And what happened was, for my uncle, they wrote no one at home when they went there. see sheet 71, lines 27 to 29. And then you have to go all the way to the end over here somewhere and look for page 71. This is why it'll be good when the name index is actually done. It's a little more complicated doing it this way. Okay, so here's sheet 71. And if I go down here, these three people are actually my relatives, Francis, Ruth, and William Muller. So for some reason, they don't show up when I tried to do a name search, but if I searched by street address, I was able to find them. I know that's a really quick example, but Ancestry is saying they hope by the end of the summer that they'll have the name indexing done. So let's see how that goes, because I don't know if they can get it done that fast. So I think our time is about up. So do we have any questions? Oh, okay. If you have any questions, you can unmute yourself. I'll stop sharing my screen. Whoa. Or you can even put a question in the chat if you want. Or you can always stop by the library, usually here at the reference desk. If you have questions about the census or other questions, and hopefully, in 4 or 5 months, maybe there'll be a name index for this 1950 census. Oh, and don't forget to pick up your family tree gift at the reference desk, either later today or on Friday. But I appreciate everyone coming today, and I hope that I was able to give you some helpful information on searching census records. Thanks, everybody.